I'm Sylvie Kashdan. I am currently 82 years old. I was born in New York City in the borough of Brooklyn in the neighborhood of Brownsville. I'm now living in Seattle, Washington. And I'm actually living in a co-housing community, which is not anarchist, but there are some anarchists living here. It's a self-governing little community, intentional community near downtown Seattle. Anyway, that's where I am now. My mother and her family were Ukrainian Jews, and half of the family fled the Ukraine at the beginning of the 20th century to escape the pogroms. There's a whole bunch of stories about that, but they had to sneak across the border because they were not the kind of people who could be given permission to leave the Russian Empire. And so when I used to hear these stories about it, I came to understand borders were things that could hold people in as well as leave them out, lock them out. So she fled to the United States, and when she was 12 years old, she was sent into a factory to work as a seamstress. Half of the family stayed and were later decimated by the Nazi invasion. They lived, I guess, in a little shtetl near Kiev. Anyway, my father's family actually came from Siberia, and they were Siberian natives. At the same time, there was a drive on the part of the Russian government to make these people settle down. They lived in Siberia on the west side or the western part of Lake Baikal. And he and his family, half of them fled to the West, and the other half were subject to first the empire and then to the Bolshevik conquest. Both of my parents felt a lot of distrust for both the Russian government and the Bolsheviks, and also the American government. They felt very acutely aware that there was a lot of discrimination against immigrants and refugees. They liked the New Deal things that were being done, the social program, and we actually lived in a public housing project from the time that I was about 3 or so that was built in that neighborhood. And then they liked those things, but they did not like the persecution of immigrants or of African Americans or the anti-left politics, such as the persecution of the Rosenbergs. But they were not sympathetic to the Communist Party. And it took me a long time to learn why a lot of the working people that I grew up with didn't like the Communist Party, because no one ever explained these things to me as a child. But I sort of intuitively got the idea that no government can be counted on for care or protection of any sort. So it's something that I found out before I became involved in social issues. My mother spoke Yiddish, and she spoke some English, what we used to call broken English, basically a little bit of English. She couldn't really read or write that much. She could spell out words. My father, I think he went to school to the 6th grade, although I'm not entirely sure, but he could read and write, and not only Yiddish, but Spanish and several other languages that were spoken in our neighborhood. And in our neighborhood, there were people from the Caribbean, and including people from Puerto Rico, and there were also African Americans from the South, and immigrants like my family, and people who were born in the United States like me and my sister. My sister was 3 years older than me. There were only 2 kids in the family. My parents didn't want either my sister or me to learn to speak Yiddish or any other language because they were afraid we would be discriminated against. So even though they spoke to each other in Yiddish, they never wanted us to know what they were talking about. But we sort of picked up intuitively, but we also both sort of developed a sense of fear and had trouble learning foreign languages later in life. I respect people who learn foreign languages a whole lot. But I am not the one to do it. I would say my father was a great believer in grassroots unionism, and he was also involved with the workers, with the workmen's circle. But he used to say he's going out to the workmen's circle, but never explained to me what it was about. I only found out as a young adult in my late 20s that the workmen's circle was a place where socialists and anarchists and liberal working people, unionists got together to discuss different things. But at the time, as a child, I just got the idea that it was a place that he liked to go. When I met Sam and Esther Dolgoff, anarcho-syndicalists who were seniors when I was young, I learned about what the workmen's circle was much more than that. Okay, then the other influence in my life is that when my sister was born, my parents were quite happy. But then when I was born, they were disappointed. They wanted me to be a boy, and I was clearly not a boy. I was actually given a name that was supposed to relate to my great-grandfather, who was apparently a respected shaman in his home country, in his home territory, or whatever you would want to call it. But what they used to do, a lot of immigrants would name their children after people who they admired. And for people who were Jewish, it tended to be that it should be somebody who died already. I don't know for the other side, but my sister's name was Audrey, and she was named after Udal, who was my mother's grandmother, who had been respected as a woman in the shtetl. She was one of the few people who could read and write, and so she was highly respected. So I was given a name that started with an S sound, so that sort of defined things. So I grew up not wanting to be a boy, but wanting to be able to do all the things that boys could do. I like to run around and climb fences and do all sorts of things, but I wasn't an athlete, and I never actually desired to be part of competitive sports. I don't think I would have done well if I had anyway. So those are all kind of influences that I had. In elementary school, I did very poorly. I hated it, and then I had a lot of emotional issues because at home, my parents had emotional issues, particularly my mother was traumatized by her exposure to Russian soldiers marauding through the villages, having their fun by scaring children and even shooting people. Anyway, but when I got to high school, I decided I was going to work hard because I wanted to go to college, so that would be the right thing to do. However, most of my friends were still in the classes that didn't go to college. I ended up in honor classes. But what I felt because of all this was that I had learned a skill of how to do well academically, not that doing well academically was a sign of intelligence. So I sort of developed my own intuitive knowledge that academics is not necessarily intelligence, and how students learn shouldn't be based on what their academic scores are. I did get good academic scores in high school, and I did okay in college too, I would say. But when I was in high school, I also wanted to go to college and become a nuclear physicist. I was very much interested in nuclear energy and read a whole lot about it on my own. A lot of the teachers and the students said to me, "Oh, when you get married and you have children, you won't want to do that anymore." And I did change my mind about wanting to do it, but not because of getting married and having children, but because I found out that nuclear energy was pretty bad stuff. I learned about the poisoning of the environment by mining, by running nuclear plants, and by waste product, as well as by the bomb, using the bomb, storing the bomb, et cetera, et cetera. So I decided that I would go into philosophy and social sciences instead. And that's what I actually ended up doing, was going into that field and concentrating more on human issues, which was what I was interested in. I was lucky enough, as I said, to grow up in a multicultural neighborhood. I didn't think much of it when I was a kid, but it was a neighborhood that was built around people who came into the city and were looking for, into the city of New York, and were looking for places that they could afford. And there were these different areas where a variety of people who were not well off had lived together and continued to live together. By the 50s and the 60s, segregation was beginning to set in, and the neighborhood got to be a less family friendly. And I probably, the police always thought it was a dangerous neighborhood, but it got to be more dangerous for the actual people who lived there. But when I was there, I just took for granted that some of my friends would be of one background and some would be of another. And we sort of cooperated with each other, and the families and the housing projects even cooperated with each other. Some parents, some women helped to give the women who were giving birth to give birth there. My mother gave birth in the hospital, but she had health problems, and it wasn't, I don't think she had to pay. I think in those days there were possibilities for people who met economic requirements, but I don't know all the details. But anyway, being that way, I was very lucky. So when I was still in high school, I was invited by some friends to walk a picket line protesting the discrimination against African American workers in restaurants in New York. I was really very shy, but I felt okay about walking back and forth on a picket line with other people. I like to be able to do that. So that sort of introduced me on a grassroots level to the civil rights movement. I never was anything more than a person who could be called on to come and be supportive in some way or another. So I didn't get more deeply involved. When I was in college, the Vietnam War was ramping up, and I was very interested about that. And I tried to learn a lot about that. We had a radio station, a Pacifica radio station, WBAI, part of I guess, nonprofit realm, and they had on there a lot of coverage of protests and protesters. And so I learned about that a lot from them. And then some people that I got to know in school were pacifists, and they were doing things like fasts and vigils. I was invited to join them, but I respected their convictions, but I didn't really feel that what they were doing was effective, and I didn't think that it was me. I didn't feel like a pacifist, but I also found out that there was a Students for a Democratic Society branch on the campus. I was at City College. I don't know if I said that. I was at City College, part of the city of New York. I heard about them and I thought, oh, this would be interesting to go to from what I had heard. But then when I went there, the meetings were very boring and very controlled. I didn't feel that I fit in at all. And I later found out that that branch was controlled by the Progressive Labor Party, I guess a super Leninist and at that time super Maoist organization. So I didn't go to any more after 2 or 3. I went them and sat in the back and said, I'm glad I'm in the back and I can leave. So I did join an anti-draft group and learned to be a draft counselor. And I went to the high schools that were open for the summer for kids to make up classes that they had problems with, and set up table with some other people and did draft counseling there. And then I actually did some draft counseling when I got to college of some people too. In, I don't know, 1967 or so, I discovered, I think it's Free Life. Life's they had a store. It was right-wing libertarians, but they had one bookshelf of left libertarian material. So I was able to discover the material that was being put out by Chicago Solidarity, by the Solidarity by Freedom Press in London, and by a bunch of others, including the people who became Black and Red, Lorraine and Freddie Perlman. I also became aware of Sam Dolgoff and the Libertarian Book Club. So I began to be familiar with a lot of other stuff. And the IWW, I got interested in that. So basically, I got very interested in a whole bunch of things and began to get into it, began to get involved in attending different meetings and to learn a lot about anarchism and anti-authoritarian history. In the fall of 1967, I began graduate school at the New School for Social Research, and there I became an active member of their Students for a Democratic Society branch, or I forget what they called them anyway. And they had a lot more interesting people, and it was more stimulating meetings than the one at City College. So I got involved with that. I did some things like I worked with a guy from the newsreel, radical filmmaker, to do showings of the films that they put out, and then there's a bunch of stories around that, but I won't go into everything. I also sat at literature tables and talked with the other students from the new school who came to look at what we were doing. So that, and with a friend, I distributed an English version of On the Poverty of Student Life, a text that became associated with the Situationists, as well as disrupting several classes, especially those in which instructors were promoting pro-capitalist and pro-imperialist ideology. That's what we did. And I was very good at doing the disruption, but my fellow student was very good at articulating the ideas later. But he kept on telling me I was fantastic, that he couldn't do it without me. So I appreciated that I was able to do something. In April in 1968, I was invited by a number of friends and associates at Columbia University, the chapter of Students for a Democratic Society, to come to the campus and participate during the first hour of the occupation there. So I was a grassroots participant observer there. Again, I was at a stage in my life that when I spoke in public, I was sure I had made a fool of myself. Other people didn't always think that, but I was very shy, but I really did appreciate being there, experiencing things, and being able to think about it. There were 5 buildings at Columbia University that I'm not hearing all of them talked about. Maybe it's relevant, maybe it's not. But there was Hamilton Hall that everybody hears about, Low Library, what's this? Fairweather Hall, Avery Hall, and Mathematics Hall. Each of them had a little different social atmosphere, which was very interesting. It was like, without people intending to, they seemed to be replicating a lot of other social upheavals that had occurred, although obviously this was only on a campus and it didn't go really far after. I was first at Hamilton Hall and left at the time when the African American student leaders said all the whites had to get out of the building because the SDS leaders who had been talking with them were unable to agree on an official occupation. I think that not only whites, but some other international students of different sorts left, but that's another story for another day. Anyway, so we first went to Low Library and were there for a while, but then we left Low Library, me and a bunch of other people, because of the fact that Progressive Labor Party had become dominant there, and we went to the Mathematics Building, which later became a place where a lot of anti-authoritarian and anarchist people could get together and collaborate. So it was a building that was barricaded, was an actual occupation, but had a lot more openness to different ideas and stuff. And then there were a few other buildings, and the one like Fairweather was totally open. However, when the police came in, they brutalized those people as much as they brutalized all the people who were in the other buildings, except for Hamilton, where a compromise was made because the university was concerned about the relationship with the Black neighborhood around Columbia. Anyway, it was an interesting experience, and I learned a lot about how social processes work on a one-to-one basis. So I decided to try and learn more about things, and so I took a year off and visited people in Europe and England, and came back a year later and went back to graduate school and continued some kinds of activities. I realized I became, and still am, not an organization joiner or a tendency joiner, but a project joiner. I'm a person who joins or helps to create projects of different sort at different times. So that's basically how I would identify myself now. When I will say also, I always found the Marxists to be very mechanistic, Marxist ideas, but I don't necessarily have to go into that. It's something though that I've carried with me for a long time. When I returned, to New York, I also got a job in sociology at the department of Brooklyn College, part of the City University, working in what was called the small college program in the evening, which was for community activists, adults who wanted to get a college education but couldn't afford to stop working. So it was a special program, and there was a lot of openness. I was allowed to design my own curriculum and work with students in a very open, egalitarian way, which I enjoyed a lot. I loved working there and worked there for 5 years, but I learned a lot about academic faculty politics that I would rather have not known. So during my time there, I received good peer observations of my classes. So I was asked to take on classes that other instructors had to leave for physical or psychological reasons. I also agreed to teach advanced courses, which I enjoyed, but which most other instructors who were working in the evening didn't want to do. I'd been hired as an adjunct, which didn't mean much to me at the time, but I later found out that the union, which was a fusion, I won't go into that, but that the union had just signed a new contract that made for the adjunct designation to be one a little different than it had been before, very specifically not eligible for tenure, and very specifically to be at lower pay. And even though adjuncts were required to have the same qualifications as full-timers. So I found out that the contract negotiated specified that the adjuncts had considerably lower pay than the full-timers. So adjuncts could make something like $4,000 a year, which wasn't great, to say the least. But the assumption was they could maybe pick up other courses in other schools, and the full-timers could make as much as $25,000 a year, although some of them might have only made $15,000. So anyway, all this made me a little angry. I didn't know what to do, so I went to my department head and asked about why, since I was carrying more than 9 credit hours for several semesters, why I couldn't have the higher pay rate. And he said, very friendly, well, we could give you the back pay, but you'll never work in the New York area again. So that didn't sound very, very good. So I decided I wouldn't go for that, but I wanted to figure out what to do. The IWW couldn't help me. Their IWW at that point was not yet doing the kind of work that they're doing now. Well, I'm not sure how it would be handled now, but they didn't know what to do. Okay, but I did find some other adjuncts who were quite angry too, and who wanted to do something about it. And so we formed the Adjunct and Part-Time Faculty Association. And we tried negotiating with the union for several months, but couldn't get anywhere with them. And after that, people said maybe we should get a lawyer. So with my radical connections, I found Bert Hall, who was a lawyer who did radical labor cases for free. And he, like a whole lot of other lawyers apparently at that time, would do work for landlords, writing leases for businesses or for bars. And I knew a few other lawyers like that. They would get good money doing that, and then they would spend their spare time, whatever you might call that, doing legal cases. So he agreed to come and talk with the group that I was in. And then he did agree to go to a meeting of the union that was open to all members, and he came along. And it turned out he actually knew some of the people who were in the hierarchy of the union, because he had helped them when they were being attacked because of the loyalty oaths and being suspected of being communists and so forth. And so he gave them a lecture about how they should really not be doing this, that he didn't fight for these people so that they could then turn their back on fellow workers. So after that, the union bureaucrats did seem visibly shaken, but Bert Hall said to us afterwards that he would be willing to take a case to court to fight for equal pay and equal benefits. We didn't get any health coverage either, and any of the other benefits that the full-timers got. So he said that, and I thought that was a wonderful idea, but my fellow adjuncts in this group didn't want to do that. They wanted to try to further negotiate. So I didn't feel I could do it by myself. It didn't feel like it would make sense. So Bert Hall was annoyed with me for not being brave. The other people didn't care. They were willing to have me continue to collaborate. We worked and got nowhere. Now I'm very glad to see people getting somewhere, getting some more representation. So that was, I learned that about what it meant to be, and a whole bunch of lessons related to that kind of thing. I know that there were some people who actually identified themselves as anarchist or anti-authoritarian, who were working in the system as full-timers, who told me very openly, wait till you get your tenure, just work on that. But anyway, there's a lot of lessons and a lot of of different experiences. I won't spend my time on that. So basically, I had to go on and do other things, which I did. I found out that I actually enjoyed teaching and learning when it could be done in an open kind of anti-authoritarian way. And so along with my partner, Robbie Barnes, I got involved in working at the Columbia Free School, and which was a thing that was set up the summer after, and later on, the summer after 1968 occupation. Later on, I got involved in working in the Free Association, which was an anti-authoritarian school that lasted for a while, but then was taken over by, I don't know, some authoritarians. They didn't like having anarchists there. But I became interested in learning about anarchist histories and what was current in places like Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And so I did a lot of research on that, and we got in touch with the Zura Library. I found out about people in Hong Kong who were doing the 70s front, some from China proper, some from Hong Kong, and beginning to develop more anti-authoritarian perspectives. Got to know about the Cuban anarchists, and Sam Dolgoff was in the middle of writing. Well, I got to know Sam Dolgoff earlier, over several years, got to be friendly and go and sit and chat, Sam and Esther. And I guess in the middle of the 70s, Sam was working on his book on Cuba. And so Robbie and I went down and visited the Cuban anarchists there and had some very interesting conversations. And I got involved in doing talks about both what was happening in Cuba, or what had happened in Cuba, in addition, and what was happening for people in Hong Kong with respect to anarchist perspective. And also, I did several talks about the Russian Revolution, the anarchists, and the Makhnovists relationship there. And so there were some other things I participated in, where I was doing open talks and discussions and enjoying that kind of thing. Yeah, and I could list a whole bunch of things. Anyway, basically, yeah. After a while, I stopped being involved in the Wobblies because I found like I was uncomfortable with their discussion of signing up to be made bargaining agents, even though they were still on the blacklist and whatever. I just felt that it was getting a little beyond what I was interested in, but I still actually have a soft spot for my Wobblies friends and for Wobblies in the past. I think that once one is a real Wobbly, one never stops being a Wobbly, even if one doesn't pay their dues. Okay, so that's what I think, and I appreciate a lot of what they're doing today too. So when I moved to Seattle in 2000 and no, what am I saying? 1981. When I moved to Seattle in 1981, I became a friend of Left Bank. Means that I'm a supporter of Left Bank, have been helpful in fundraising and different things, publicity, and doing book group things there. So that continues to the present in different ways. So that's one of the things that I continue to do now, even though it's been many, many years, and even though sometimes they need more help than others. In 1989, I began teaching English as a new language, first as a volunteer and then as a teacher. And I enjoyed that too. I enjoyed working with adults. I always enjoy working with people who want to learn things and who want to take initiative in learning things. So has fit in with my doing that as a regular job. I stopped doing that in 2014 or so, but I did that for quite a while. In 1999, there was a World Trade Organization meeting here in Seattle that became very famous. And I was involved with a group that prepared for this meeting by finding and reading archival material, having some discussion, and then some of us put out a pamphlet about the 1919 general strike in Seattle with the slogan, "We did it then, we can do it again." So that was basically what I think a valuable thing that we did, to have a conversation as well as marches. And there were a lot of other conversations that went on during the visit of the World Trade Organization. Since then, I've been involved in organizing a radical lending library that is oriented to anti-authoritarian and anarchist material, Los Quixotes, that's named after the Spanish revolutionaries who were organized and against the takeover by the communists of the takeover and killing by the communists of the Spanish Revolution, that they felt that there was a betrayal. So I know, I guess I have done some talks as I learned about that, some talks since then. Also, over the years, I've been involved with the Fifth Estate newspaper, magazine, whatever it is at this point. And I had written articles for them about different things. I really enjoyed doing that kind of thing. So in 2014, my partner Robbie and I told people who were working on the paper that we wanted to scan and character recognize articles to put online, to have an archive of the material, because it's such a wide variety of perspectives. There's not just one anarchist tendency represented. There's a lot of different things represented. So they agreed, and we've been working on it ever since. At the same time, we were asked if we would like to join the editorial collective, and we said yes, and we've been doing that since 2014 also. So I've been exposed to a lot of different tendencies and ideas because of doing that too. Anyway, that's a project also. It's definitely not an organization. In the 1960s and 70s and 80s, I didn't want to be identified as an anarchist because I didn't want to identify with any specific tendency. I could see why, some people might want to, but from my point of view, I wanted to express myself where I felt it would count and where I felt I would be most true to what I would wanted. I felt it was both adequate and maybe important to engage in projects that could contribute to anarchistic possibilities, and that's what I've concentrated on. But as right-wingers began using the label anarchist to brand opponents, I decided to identify myself as an anarchist. Then this is still true. Now I will call myself an anarchist, but I'm an anarchist, not an anarchist member of or of any particular tendency. For me, anarchism is a perspective that seeks to realize non-hierarchical relations between people similar and different in their backgrounds, respecting and supporting each other, and participating in mutual aid for the joy of cooperation. That's how I would think about anarchism. it doesn't come automatically, and it does not require automatic formulas, but it does require paying attention to the communication of other people and being dedicated to learn from each other. So to me, that's very much what's going on, that we have to be paying attention to each other, and working together on projects, to me, is a good way for people to learn how to respect each other more. I think that that's what's most important to me. I was never a pacifist or an insurrectionist, although I can understand that sometimes techniques used by either of these groups make sense, but I wouldn't want to identify myself as either. For me, and I think many others who I've known over the years, and many others who I would consider anarchist and anti-authoritarian, that I've known over the years, including in the 1960s, the debate over violence and nonviolence has been something like empty. My main concern is that people's activities involve means, involve means that mirror the desired end. I think it's very important that we have means that can lead to the right end. I don't think that any means necessary can be counted on to lead to an anarchistic or anti-authoritarian end. So to me, that's what is really important. That, and I think that things like militarization, concentrating on military tactics, or some of the other things that I hear, I'm not happy with, but I think that the only way that things can be worked out is by talking about them. And I am very interested in the struggles and activities that are going on for people who have been in Syria, people who have been in other places where the difficulties arise. And I am hoping that more and more people develop a consciousness about the importance of the means and the ends. I believe that developing egalitarian and anarchistic ways of relating to others will make it easier for us to develop the right ends. And I think actually means and ends are so connected that they never unloop. That means lead to ends that lead to means that lead to ends. I don't think there's ever, from my point of view, an end that's going to be, now we're finished, now's the revolution. I think it has to be carried on in a way that is kind of always trying to define ends, trying to understand what we can do that'll make our relationships with each other and our understanding of each other improved. So that's basically where I stand. I'm not against people defending themselves. I'm very much for people defending themselves, but I'm very much against people professionalizing that. So I don't know. That's basically what I was going to say.